Hey everybody, this is Isaiah and welcome back to Magic System Monday. Now today I want to talk about Richter Belmont from Castlevania Nocturne. Now Richter has this subplot regarding a traumatic event that happens earlier in his childhood that causes him to lose the ability to use magic. And while he does eventually regain the ability to use magic, there are a number of criticisms that are levied against this part of the story. So what I want to do is, I want to address the problem itself and talk about how I would go about fixing this and making it make sense. But in order to do that, I'd have to address the original course of events. For those of you who have already watched Castlevania Nocturne, I would recommend skipping this part of the video. Now Richter is part of the Belmont family, and the Belmont family trains its members to fight monsters and more specifically vampires. But when Richter was younger, his mother died at the hands of a very powerful vampire. Even more so, it was implied that her death may have also been in part due to Richter, because he interfered with the fight even though he was instructed to run away. To make matters worse, the vampire chose to spare Richter on more or less a whim, knowing full well that he would eventually try to get revenge on him for killing his mother. Now the next time we see Richter is in his teenage years, and while he's still a capable fighter able to go against vampires and win, he noticeably has the inability to do magic. However, he doesn't really seem to want to talk about it. It's made clear during the story that he doesn't actually know why he lost his magic, but he seems to know that it has something to do with the trauma of losing his mom in the way that he did. Now, interestingly enough, this doesn't really seem to affect his performance in combat very much. It doesn't appear that he's afraid of fighting or afraid of vampires or anything like that, although it is worth noting that he considers himself to be of relatively low intellect, despite the fact that we later learned that his mother considered him to be rather intelligent as a child. This is not an important detail, but I will use it later. But anyway, things start to pick up in the plot when Richter and his allies bust into what they believe is a Forge Master stronghold. And it's here that after fighting a number of night creatures that he created, as well as a few vampire allies, Richter is met face to face with Olrox, the vampire that killed his mother all those years ago. And upon seeing him for the first time after all those years,
she's a runner, she's a track star. She gon' run away when it gets hard.
Now after leaving all of his allies to fend for themselves, he meets a character named which I believe is his uncle or granddad or something like that. I can't exactly recall. But in any case, Zeus is about 60 years old, and we learn from him that he actually has the same issue that Richter does, being unable to utilize his magic despite the fact that he had incredible potential with it earlier on in life. We also learn that the trauma that caused the loss of his magic was the death of his wife and best friend. After Richter questions him on how he might regain his magic, Zeus simply tells him that everything is pointless and that evil always wins or some bullcrap like that. I can't exactly recall, but you get the idea. Guy clearly spends too much time on Twitter, but whatever. But in any case, while Richter spends some time ruminating on that would-be wisdom, he and Zeus are attacked by vampires, and after that the vampires tell Richter that once they're done there, they're gonna murder the rest of his allies, which are effectively his new family since his mother died. After hearing this, he kinda snaps, miraculously regaining his magic, and proceeds to go to town on those vampires. But in the very next episode, he explains to one of the other main characters that when he had lost everything, he remembered all the things that were important to him that he had to protect, and for the first time in his entire life, actively made a choice to decide who he wanted to be. And he decided that he wasn't going to let fear govern his identity anymore. So, what's the problem here? Well, there are a number of problems, and the first one being that the revelation that this character receives to get his magic back effectively doesn't make any sense. The character was never governed or defined by fear. He was never a fearful character, and that never seems to affect his other actions. It only seems to be blocking his magic. While I do believe personally as a magic system expert, it would be better to add at least a few small mechanics here and there to make the idea make more sense. Ultimately, the idea of him having a mental block really isn't a bad one. The problem is, it doesn't match his character, not with what we have here. The character himself states that fear was the problem. Aside from the fact that he chickened out when coming up against Olrox, that doesn't seem to reflect him at all. So in order to make this make sense, we'd have to establish a new reason. Now the second problem that people are very eager to bring up here is the simple fact that the pacing of this story is bad. Now, this story has 8 episodes, and many people consider it an anime. I don't feel like getting into technicality. It may or may not be, I don't remember. Most anime usually have like 12 to 13 episodes per season. That's unless they get a 2-core season, which is probably around 26. And this story, by comparison, really doesn't have that much time to build up. So, with almost every other issue in the story, the go-to argument that people have is that it should have had more time to build up. I understand this, and I largely agree with it. I think the story was too short, and there were a lot of things that had to be glossed over, but I actually don't think that's the main problem. And the reason I think that is because no amount of adding extra time to the story was going to make this make more sense, because the internal rules that the story relies upon to make this work literally aren't there. So what's the point of adding extra time for a story that doesn't use the time it has efficiently? So let's talk about how I would go about reworking this subplot to make it make sense and be narratively satisfying, while staying in line with the original amount of runtime that the writers had access to. Now, the first thing I would suggest doing is giving a name to the condition that Richter has. Just having a name for this issue makes the world building feel a little bit deeper. It makes it feel as though this is a real, legitimate thing that exists in the world that the characters interact with and respond to. It also makes more sense that this should have a name because there should already be a precedent for this happening in world. Even though people who use sorcery or magic are rare, those characters are often well versed in the way magic works on its own, and even more so, they have a working understanding of most other types of magic, even if they do not use those magics themselves. It stands to reason to me that if a person's mental state could affect the way magic works, there should be some form of literature on that, even if it doesn't happen to that many people, because it happened to 2 people in the Belmont family alone in the past 30 years. That on its own to me means somebody should have studied this. It doesn't even matter what name you come up with, it just has to have one, and the relevant characters who use magic should probably know what it is. Now, the next thing we should do is establish the mental block that'll be affecting the character's magic. Now, as you all know, magic systems are my area of expertise, so to me it stands to reason that the best course of action would be to add some small underlying mechanics to the magic system that allow this issue to take place. It can still be a soft magic system. We don't need all the details fleshed out, just a couple of core mechanics. Now, I would say that magic should require an understanding of a person's true nature as a character, their convictions, as well as a decisive will. The types of magic that they have an affinity for will be determined by their nature and their convictions. And by understanding those natures and convictions, a person can understand what magic best suits them. And once they learn to harness and channel that magic, a person's decisive will is what determines their ability to actually control that magic. A person has to be willing to actualize on what they want the world to be like, to call the forces of magic into the physical world. As a result, a person who is either lacking in willpower, is indecisive, or is not willing to actualize their will upon the world, is incapable of using their magic effectively.
You gotta really dwell on it.
And this, I think, is an interesting segue into what I think Richter's mental block should be. I think Richter should be capable of understanding how powerful he is and what he's capable of, at least in terms of being a physical fighter. But what I think his mental trauma should be blocking is his sense of autonomy, or at least the self-worth that revolves around that autonomy. See, when he was younger, Richter made a choice to stay and fight with his mother, even though he was strictly told to go away. And as a result of his interference, his mother met an untimely demise. It stands to reason to me that this would have a strong impact on a character like Richter, a person who, being part of the Belmont family, probably holds an immense amount of responsibility or pride on their self, that by his power and by his choices he's able to make the world a better place and rid it of monsters. But in this case, it was his choice that took his mother's life away. In his mind, it's not Olrock's fault that his mother is dead, it's his. And maybe, just maybe, he doesn't trust his own autonomy anymore. He doesn't trust his ability to make serious choices. Not that he's incapable of fighting or swinging a sword or stabbing a vampire in the throat or anything like that. His problem is that he can't make meaningful choices, not because he has an inability to, but because of his trauma he doesn't trust himself to do so anymore. Look back on the course of the story and think about how many serious, meaningful choices he made outside of fighting. Truth be told, aside from him getting his magic back in the first place, and him telling Maria's mother not to come with them when they first scouted out the vampires at the mansion, he really hasn't made any genuine choices. And remember, there's enough of a precedent in the story itself that this character seems to believe that he's not qualified to make certain types of choices. He tells Maria and her mother Tara that he doesn't have to understand the things that they fight for. He just has to trust them, and then he can use himself as a tool for their goals, because he believes that they're intelligent enough to know what is good and what is bad. And remember, once the group was considering whether or not they should go to bust out a dwarf after he became a night creature, he was upset with the group because he did not believe they were committing to proper planning. He believed himself to be the only person in the room that was unintelligent enough to come up with a plan. He believed that going without a plan is dangerous, but he wasn't willing to make one himself. He wanted everyone else to do it, and because he did not perceive them to be doing that, he became upset. In the moment, the story tried to make it about fear, but as I told you, I don't think that's the best choice. To make matters worse, when they got inside the Forge Master's lair and Olrox appeared, this doesn't strictly have to be a moment portraying how afraid of him that Richter is. Instead, Olrox, as the person who inflicted the first trauma upon him, could be a representation to him of his inability to make proper choices. Because while he could stay and fight the way he always does, Olrox should be a perfect reminder to him about the last time he tried to do that and what it cost him. It stands to reason to me that if we're following this logic, which is not canon by the way, it's just me making this up, that at no point would Richter think himself responsible enough or qualified enough to ever fight someone like Olrox. So of course, from his perspective, all he could do is run away, because making the choice to fight is a non-option. Under this logic, it stands to reason to me that Richter has, in a sense, sort of lobotomized himself. That the decisive will that he would actualize upon the world to get his magic to manifest has been so impaired by this new way of thinking, and by actively denying himself intellectual or emotional responsibility for making these meaningful choices, that he simply cannot use his magic anymore, because the core drive to shape the world with their own power that is required to use magic is effectively non-existent within him. There we are. It's a little bit rough around the edges, but I think this is a lot better than just saying, oh, he was afraid, even when it wasn't consistent with his character. Now, the thing to do now is to figure out how to insert this narrative into the story without changing too much about the story itself. And for this, I would employ an idea that I mentioned maybe about a year ago in the Naruto video, and that would be the art of two sentences. It revolves around the idea that most forms of exposition within stories, whether they be manga, whether they be anime, or most novels, assuming they're not overly drawn out, isn't actually that large. In fact, if you go through Castlevania Nocturne itself, or the original Castlevania series on Netflix, you'll learn that most explanations about how the world works are not only intermittent, but also not that long at all. And as a result, if you find something that doesn't make sense, or something that you want to add to the ideas of the story, it doesn't necessarily have to make the story that much more complicated at all, or even add very much to the exposition of the story. By either adjusting or adding one or two well-placed sentences, you can effectively add things to the narrative of the story without much work. Now, having said that though, I don't think adjusting a couple of sentences over the course of 6 or 7 episodes is gonna be enough to make everything here make sense. But that's okay though, because there's still not that many things we have to adjust. There are a number of different scenes that can be used to flesh out Richter's new identity. In fact, almost all of the conversations that he has actually account for that. In fact, you could simply adjust a few of his dialogues to lean more towards this idea and it would be fine. If we wanted to find a place to add the exposition for our new interpretation of how magic works, I would suggest episode 3, because that's the episode where we learn about Annette's backstory. Annette is a character who also wields magic, although her magic comes from her heritage. But in her backstory, she was taught by an oracle before she came to France on how to use her magic properly. So it stands to reason to me that she would know a little bit about how this works. We could very well just add a couple of sentences of exposition in her flashback about how she learned how to channel her will or something like that. Although I suppose episode 2 has a good opportunity for this as well, because while the main characters are walking towards the chateau at night, they have a brief conversation about Annette and how her magic works. And this could also be an opportunity to give a little bit of exposition about how the magic works itself. Now in episode 5, after Richter manages to escape Olrox, he gets into a conversation with a couple of city girls. One of the girls tries to convince him to join the revolution with them, claiming that he has some fight in him, as it seems. However, he walks away claiming that he's tired of fighting. This sentence he says under his breath could easily be adjusted to portray his lack of confidence in himself or his own choices. Perhaps he can say that he's not qualified, or that he already made the mistake to fight once and he won't do it again. Or perhaps he says that it would cost the girl too much. I already mentioned the conversation they have before they snuck into the church, so I'm not going to bring up that again. Although that in its current state would be perfect for the narrative that I have in mind. Now having said that, I do think we need to talk about episode 6 though. Episode 6 is sort of the crux of Richter and his subplot. It's the episode where he gets confronted with the truth about him not getting his magic back, only to turn around and get his magic back. In order to make this subplot as impactful as possible, I think episode 6 needs a complete rework. This episode should focus mainly on Richter and Zeus, but I don't think they're the only characters that should be featured in its main plot. Originally, Richter and Zeus were in completely separate locations than the rest of the characters. After the two Belmonts have their conversation, they're ambushed by I think about 6 vampires that I don't even know the names of because they're not important. They're just henchmen that do the villain's will. We can do this a couple of ways. Either the main group tries to find Richter and then they get involved in the conflict with the vampires, or Richter and Zeus get ambushed by a couple of vampires or detect a vampire spy and then find out what's going to happen to the other group. And instead of the vampires saying that they're going to kill his allies after they're done killing him, it's a race against time for him and Zeus to get to the vampires that are attacking the main group. Or we can just have them all attacked as a group together. I don't know. It doesn't bother me either way, but I think this works best as long as all the characters are there for the main fight. Instead of it just being some nameless vampire characters that are attacking Richter, I think it's best if it's Olrox, because Olrox is the crux of his trauma. It makes the most sense to me that the most impactful resolution of that trauma would be to face it directly, and to face the icon of that trauma directly as well. It's in this case that I think Zeus should be injured or otherwise restrained, and the group as a whole should be losing the fight because maybe there are too many vampires alongside Olrox, or Olrox himself is just simply too strong for them. Maybe the other villains send Olrox alongside their mercenaries so he can prove his trustworthiness. But anyway, the way I imagine it, it's here that the main team is effectively losing against these vampires. And perhaps Zeus is injured, dead, or restrained, and the other teammates are about to follow suit. Perhaps Richter does not initially wish to engage in a battle with Olrox because he knows it'll end poorly, and he doesn't have confidence that he can actually succeed. And in a critical moment where one of his allies are about to meet their demise at the hands of either Olrox or one of the vampires that are around him, that Richter stands up and decides that he's going to fight regardless of the consequences. And it's there in his last stand where he's about to die that he miraculously awakens his powers again. He proceeds to defeat the rest of the vampires, and Olrox does that smoky thing and disappears. Or better yet, maybe this is the scene, after all of the other enemy vampires are gone, that he decides to give them the book that he gives them in episode 7. And if you really want to preserve the plot line of the 7th episode, then you can choose to have Annette be missing from the entire ordeal, and then you can have them talk to her back at the house. But there you have it. By refusing to abdicate responsibility of making the meaningful choices in his life, and accepting the consequences of his own actions and choosing to fight anyway regardless of the risks, Richter miraculously regained his power, and while this is kind of rough around the edges and not really complete as an idea, at the very least it's better than the one that we got in the story. Although I admit that this isn't the only way of writing this conflict, if you have your own ideas on what they should have wrote instead, please feel free to mention those in the comments. But until next time, this is Isaiah from Magic System Monday. If you need me, you know where to find me. I'll see you guys later.